Excellent. Hi there, this is the Admin Junior, and yes, I am back after what seems like an incredibly long time. I'm doing tutorials again. Yay. Well, at least after my exams. Unfortunately, I've been absolutely incredibly busy. Doing 5 A-levels is not the greatest idea if you're wanting to have a bit of free time. And tutorials do take an awful lot of time to do, unfortunately. I would like to do more of them, and I would have done a lot more on the game series, but unfortunately I'm having a couple of problems with Blender and bugs in the 2.5 release, which still have to be fixed. But I will show you a little preview at the end of the next tutorial coming up on the driving game, which will be physics. So finally we'll get stuff crashing and bouncing about, and maybe even some soft bodies in there as well. So, this tutorial on the other hand will be a bit different. I have done tutorials where I've shown you me modelling some very simple objects for the racing game, but this is actually going to be a proper modelling tutorial. And it's going to start from the very basics, and it's going to move on to some more interesting topics like topology. Very interesting. So we're going to start off from the very, very beginning, as if you had only just come onto Blender right now, and I'm going to very quickly go through everything, really. So this is going to be a great reference for all the tools, all of the operations that you can do, and all of the concepts as well. Because I'm a great believer in understanding everything before you go ahead and do it. I think that really helps. So this is of course Blender. Been there, done that, bought the t-shirt hopefully by now, and if you are not exactly new to all this, then I am rushing through it, so it's no biggie. Okay, so to start off with, we're going to use the add menu to insert a new object, a new shape, and that is Shift A to open up the add menu, and mesh, and we're going to go with plane to start off with. Remembering we're in top view at the moment, which is number pad 7. So, what is a mesh to begin with? What is a mesh? Well, the term mesh is bandied about a lot, and you know it's not exactly the most understood statement in the world. But what essentially a mesh is it's a way of describing a two-dimensional or three-dimensional object in terms of vertices, edges, and faces. Now this is a very, very simple mesh. This is what's called a plane, and it's just your average bog standard common or garden quadrilateral. So, what we can see right here are vertices. Now, vertices, if you're looking for a more official definition, they're not just points that make up a shape. That's completely incorrect. They are points which define the circumference of a face. That's my definition. Points which define the circumference of a face. At the moment, there are 4 of them. So, then these are all interconnected with edges. Alright? Now, to add a new vertex, you press and hold Control and just click somewhere. Now, you'll see it's automatically added it as an edge for me. I don't want that at the moment, so I'm going to deselect everything and then Control click. So now I've just got some random vertex just floating around in the middle of nowhere. Again, I can then deselect it and add another one. So the first thing we're going to talk about is building objects from vertices, so doing things the manual way. Now what I'm going to do with these two is create an edge. An edge is the next component of the shape of the mesh, and an edge is basically comprised of 2 vertices connected together. Now we form an edge by selecting the 2 vertices, I'll just hide that, and pressing F. And that gives us a nice straight line, and doesn't always, but it just happens to at this point, and that creates an edge for us. So with that, of course, tab to go into edit mode. So with that, I'm going to delete those, and we're going to look at edges. Now, edges, of course, as I said, are made up of 2 vertices, and they define, again, the boundaries of the shape of the face, but the use for them is not quite what you would imagine. The use for them is to do with topology, and again we're going to come on to that. But what we're going to explore is how we can use these edges, and more importantly how we can use edge loops to form nice curves and to form nice shapes. So what I've done here is actually created an edge in the middle of the object. You can do the same with vertices. So I'm just going to add, how do it does this? I'm going to go to vertex mode. I'm going to add 2 vertices right here, and these have been connected. Now, what if I want to add a vertex right in the middle of it? Well, if we go to the tool shelf here on the right, press T to open it. If we go to the tool shelf here on the left, press T to open it. Then under Add, if you can select Subdivide, we can see that it's just added another vertex right in the middle of this edge. So it's split the edge in half effectively. Now that's that done on the vertex level. Now that's quite useful sometimes when you're just dealing with vertices. When you've already got edges and faces in place, it's not that useful because we get little problems like this. This then creates, as opposed to one face, it creates 3, and it's also created them as triangles or tris, which we don't want necessarily. So we've got to be careful when we're doing a subdivide on an already existing face, but we'll come on to that later anyway. Okay. Right, yes, so edges. So if we want to swap mode, we can either go down to the bottom here, vertex, edge and face, we can change the selection mode here, or if you're really lazy like me, you can press Control Tab and that'll bring it up right underneath your cursor. Alright, so edges. What we can do with edges is basically form. Edges are a bit more complex than vertices. Vertices are obvious. They make up the look of the shape, basically. It's as simple as that. They make up the look of the face. Edges, on the other hand, are useful for moving 2 vertices at a time. Yes, I'll admit. But other than that, their usage is a bit more complicated. Because with edges form, when you have multiple faces, edges form loops. And these loops and these patterns that they make are really important in defining good 3D models. So, those are the edges. We're going to move on to faces. Now, the face is the greatest component, the largest component. It's made up of 3 or 4 vertices. Now, the majority of the time, we want a face which is made up of 4 vertices. Why? Because the mesh then looks nicer, it subsurfs a lot nicer, and it allows you to create much more fluid looking shapes. Don't just take it from me, you can try it out yourself. A lot of noobs, a lot of newbies will start off and they will just trace some sort of outline, some image, or just look at something and make it, and they'll just trace it with edges, with vertices, and we'll try and fill them all together in some way. This is a bad move, because if you do that, then you start filling them full of 3 vertices faces and 4 as opposed to 4 vertices faces, and that is a problem. And they get horrible black lines and strange shapes and weird things going on, and they don't know why. Well, this is the answer. So, a face with 4 vertices is called a quad, for quadrilateral obviously, and a face with 3 vertices is called a tri, or for triangle obviously as well. Faces are also referred to as polygons, because they have many vertices, basically. I don't know. So, the first thing we can do with these is possibly the most simplest and the most basic and the most fundamental operation that you can do with them, which is extrusion. And it is incredibly useful. There would be no 3D modeling without extrusion. Now, extrusion is a fancy way of saying copying but keeping it linked. Now, we can copy anything with Shift D. and we can move this about, and we can constrain it to an axis by pressing a letter X, Y, or Z. But this just creates a copy. Now these two are not linked. I could go up manually and select each of these vertices and press F, like I did, press F, and it will create a face. But I don't want to do that because that's slow. It's a bit of a pain, especially when you haven't just got 2, you've got about 33. Not a good idea. So instead, what I'm going to do is extrude. Now extrusion, as I said, is like copying, like duplication, but it keeps it linked. Now in this case, I mean linked with edges. So if I press E for extrude, it's already given me an axis to constrain it on, and you'll see, if I bring this down, not only has it duplicated it, but it's joined it together. So we now have an approximation, if we do it properly. Now we now have our basic cube, but formed from a simple plane. So that's extrusion. If we now take this face at the end here, extrude that, we can see we can already create some sort of shape very easily. There we go. Excellent. So, that's extrusion. Now I'm going to talk about forming simple shapes. So as before, we created a plane and then extruded it to make a cube. This time I'm going to add a circle, and we're going to make a cylinder out of it. So, I can see the circle has not been filled in. Now I could have checked it to be filled in, but I'm not going to, because there are two different ways that we can fill this in. So first of all, we're going to start off by extruding this down on the z-axis. So we can see we've already got the main basis for our cylinder. And now is probably a good time to talk about selection, because there are lots of vertices here. Now, selecting in Blender is done in a couple of ways. So to start off with, obviously right-clicking on a vertex or an edge or a face, we'll just select that. But only that vertex, only that edge, only that face on its own. If we then hold down Shift, this goes into additive or multiple selection, whereby if you then subsequently click on one of these, right-click on one of these rather, then it'll add it to the selection. And one of the great features about Blender is that if you press the undo, it's actually kept a record of the selections you've made, which has been incredibly useful for me in the past, especially with tricky selections. So that's just simple manual multiple selection. Now, the next type of selection is edge select. And this is done by pressing and holding the Alt key instead. So press Alt and right click on an edge. Edge select works in an interesting way in terms of how it deals with perpendicular edges. Because as you'll notice, when I right click and hold down Alt right now, it selects the one horizontally. So and you can see, you can tell how useful it can be. Selecting an entire loop is very, very useful. But what about this edge loop here as well? How do I know which one it's going to select? The easiest way to determine that is actually by clicking on the edge itself, or an edge in the loop. So it gives it, there's no ambiguity. You know, you're definitely selecting that edge loop. In this case I'm selecting the horizontal one, in this case I'm selecting the vertical. If you just click on a vertex, you can never really be sure which one it's going to be, and it'll actually cycle between the two of them. Okay, so the next one we're going to talk about is box selecting. Now, box selecting is a little bit more, it sounds very simple, but it's actually one of the coolest tools within Blender. It really is, it's amazing. And you press B to just be on its own to access the normal box select. As you'd imagine, you draw a box with the left mouse button and click to release, and it selects the vertices within that box. Now, this is an example of what I like to call a functional selector, in that you don't actually select anything yourself. It's not done manually. Blender does it for you. And these sort of selectors have an inverse. I'm just going to select something first. If you press B and middle mouse button drag, as opposed to left mouse button drag, it'll actually deselect the region, which is quite cool. But the really cool stuff comes now. Blender allows you to take sort of cross sections. It'll then hide everything else other than what you've told it to show. And that's not just in 2 dimensions, in 3 dimensions as well. You'll see what I mean. If you press Alt B and then select something, it just looks like it's hidden everything else. But if you look at it in 3D, you can see it's actually giving me this really cool kind of cut section, cross section rather. And what's amazing about this actually is that it's actually the full region of what you selected. So it works even when there aren't vertices there. So as you'll notice, this one is actually longer than the one I did before, but there aren't even any vertices there. So it takes a proper sort of cross section through the shape in 3 dimensions. And you have to press Alt B to get out of it again. The next cool thing about box select is a form of zooming. Now you should already know about scrolling to zoom, and shift scrolling up and down, control scrolling left and right, and if you get miles out of the way, if you press the period key or full stop key on your number pad, it'll sort of center the view back on what you're looking at. But what you won't necessarily have known about is the box zoom, which is with Shift B, and if you click and drag then over a series of vertices, it'll actually zoom in on them for you. It'll zoom in on that area. But it doesn't have an inverse. But yeah, that's Shift B. And that'll zoom right in on where you want to look at. And it'll actually fit it to the window, which is very cool indeed. So that's basically box selecting. The last couple are quite simple. C for circular select or circle select, which just you click and drag, left click and drag, and that'll select those vertices, and middle mouse button click and drag and that'll deselect them. And finally, lasso select, which is not something which I've ever really used. I never really got into the way of using it at all. But it's it's quite cool actually. You press and hold Control, and you just draw a sort of outline like that, and like so. It'll just select what the area which you've actually drawn. I've made a lot of complicated squiggles, but the basics behind it is basically this. If I don't want to select, for instance, this middle vertex here, then what I do is press and hold Control and draw a loop around all the other vertices, and then miss out that one. And you'll see it automatically closes the loop for me, and every other one is selected. There we go. So that's lasso select. I don't think it has an inverse, so I'm not sure. You have to check up on that. Anyway, right, that's selection done. There are 2 different ways we can now fill this in. I can of course select this top edge loop with this top row of edges with Alt, right click, which will give, this is the edge loop selection. And there are 2 different ways which I can now fill in this top shape. The first one, and the simplest, is to extrude. First of all, to create a linked copy of those vertices, and then merge them at the center. So Alt M for merge, and at center. You see it's told me it's removed 31 vertices, and there's only one in the middle. That is how the default cylinder is made. Do the same with the bottom here, like that. Now, why is this a problem? Why is there another way of doing this? Well, if I turn on Subsurf, say a level 2 with Control 2, you can see it's given it this weird creasing. Weird creasing. Now, unless you particularly like that, then it's not very useful. So what we do instead, to avoid this kind of thing, is extrude and then scale to 0. And you can already see, I forgot to take it off, you can already see the effect it has instead. It's a nice sort of gradiated, sort of circular thing, which if we smooth it out, as you can see, is a lot nicer. And if I turn up subsurf levels, yeah, it's nice and smooth. And goodbye creasing. So that's how you make a subsurfable cylinder. But that also means that you have a whole load of vertices all focused around this point here. As you can see, a whole load of vertices. I'm going to edge mode, and there's of course a lot of edges, but that's because there's a lot of vertices at the bottom there as well. That's the real problem. And because we're using Subsurf, that'll also be that'll also increase exponentially. So we tend not really to use this very often in game making, because it adds a whole load of unnecessary vertices. Instead, we do it manually, and that's probably a good way to do it. Right. Kind of look like a drum. So that's the cylinder. And actually, this is a good time to also talk about edge cutting, or loop cutting. Now, edge loops, as I said, or edge loops are essentially loops of edges, so a ring of interconnected edges, really. So as I said about the selection, there's a really good example of an edge loop, right there. Ring of interconnected edges. And if I move this about, for instance, you can see the effect. It has quite an interesting effect on the actual shape there. You know, 1 minute it's a cone, the next minute it's some weird capsule thing. And one of the useful things with edge loops are their use in subsurfing. Now, subsurfing actually works by finding the distance between two loops, between two vertices, between two loops, between two faces. It's finding that distance, and it creates a sort of gradiated smoothing effect. So if you did the sort of maths with me in quadratics, it's that kind of thing. It's not linear, it's not a straight edge. It tries to make it curved. But the curve that it creates is calculated between 2 points. So in this case, it's between these two edge loops. So we can control how this subsurf works by adding another edge loop. And to do that, the easiest way is to press Ctrl R. And you'll see it gives me a sort of pink line here. With this pink line, I can mark out where I want my loop. So if I left click here, we can already see it's completely changed the shape. It's now fatter, and the curve is a lot different. Now, if I move my mouse while I'm still in this mode, I can move the edge loop, and you can see how it changes the curve which is made by the subsurf. So if I want to bullet, for instance, I can drag it right down to the bottom here, although that's not really advised. If you do ever need to drag it right down to the bottom, it's probably better to use the other technique for modifying, the other technique for manipulating subsurfing, which is edge creasing. Why are we doing this? Because if you want to change the shape later on, it's a real pain to have to go back, especially if you're making something sort of semi-rectangular, you know, sort of like a curved rectangle. There's going to be loads of these edges. But if we actually turn the subsurf off, you'll notice that without it, nothing's changed at all. It's just another series of edges. But what it has done is completely changed the nature of the subsurf and the curve that it makes. So it's a very, very nice little trick there. But that's not all edge loops has to offer us. That's not all edge loops have to offer us. And we'll see that later on. Right then. That's most of the basic modelling techniques gone over. Now it's time to do something a bit more interesting. How do you start a model? What you want to try and do is keep everything as quads. So as I said, make sure you've got as many faces with 4 vertices as possible. Okay. Now circles are a good example of this, because of course when we extrude it, we can see each of these faces is 4 vertices. So there isn't really any problem with using circles to start off with. You've just got to be careful about this, the number of vertices. If you have 2 circles, or if you even have a circle you're trying to connect to some sort of square, things can get ugly if you have too many vertices. My advice is always, or generally, don't use a Boolean modifier or anything like that. You basically keep this circle, make sure the circle has as few vertices as possible without altering its shape too much. I like about 8 or 9 or 10, whatever, and just put that in. And you'll notice if I now extrude this, go vertex mode, extrude this, it forms a weird sort of shape. You wouldn't really necessarily recognize that as circular, but of course when we subsurf it, you will do. Now most of my models I use a subsurf on, even game models. I'll use a subsurf and then I'll use a decimator, which will remove as many of the vertices as possible. So there's not too high a count of those. And I'll of course then do it manually as well to get rid of as many as possible. But I use the subsurf for pretty much everything, which some would say is a bad idea, but then again, nature doesn't like straight lines. Everything in nature is curved. There's no such thing as a straight line. It's physically impossible. So it's not such a bad idea to make everything slightly curved anyway. But if you know how to use Subsurf, you'll know that everything doesn't have to be curved. That Subsurf doesn't always have to apply curves to every part of the shape and things. But what it is really useful in is if you then have this sort of 8 vertices or 10 vertices circle, which is a bit of an issue because you're trying to put it into a square at the bottom. If I add a cube here, how do I actually properly connect those two? I mean, this can be difficult. Okay, so let's try that again then. I didn't actually adhere to my own advice. Whoops, always forget to do that. So I'm going to change the vertices down to 12 instead. I either use 8 or 12 or 4 or something like that, generally. Because it depends what kind of shape you're trying to add it to. So the first thing I'm going to do is join these with Control J. And then I'm going to extrude this down, and it's going to hopefully join up with this cube. How's that going to happen? It's difficult. It's an important question, because there will come a point when you have to create some sort of curve on this joint here, and the only way you're going to do that is if they're properly connected, really. And for animation and proper deformation and things like that. Anyway, the best option really here is, first of all, making sure you have the right number of vertices. Press Control L to select these shapes. The 2 shapes have been joined. If you want to select the vertices on the original mesh, for instance, you can press Control L to select linked. And of course, I had one vertex on the cube selected all the ones on there. Control L, very useful. So what I want to do with this is subdivide it, and I've got 12 around the outside. So twice, I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's perfect. Okay, now it is a manual case of joining these up. You have to be careful here. It's a bit of a pain, really. this is going to have to be rotated. Yeah, 45 degrees. And I'm going to remove these vertices in the middle of the cube here, so it'll all connect nicely. And remember, these all really have to be squares, especially on a joint like this. Especially on a joint like this. If you have triangles, it will go horribly weird. Chances are, and you'll have to move it around until it looks a bit nicer. But there'll always be that little crease. There'll always be that little strangely shaded area. So there, that is a cube joined to a circle. And I could have put this in properly and all that. And of course when we subsurf it, that creates a very nice looking sort of shape. And of course with edge loops we can control the shape of the subsurf there, so if we want it like that, no problem. Alternatively, of course, we can bring that up, control all that stuff. We can control the curve on here, all these things. So edge loops do come in very, very useful indeed. And of course with these loops selected like that, I can scale them on the X and tune the shape as I like it. So they're very good for shape manipulation. So yeah, very, very, very useful stuff. So now I want to talk about these very, very annoying and dangerous triangles, these tris. Now what happens, for instance, if I take this plane and I subdivide it? Well, we've got 4 quads. This is a very good situation to be in, because it deforms nicely, it animates nicely, and it renders nicely. What happens, however, if I do a single subdivision along one edge? Well, it now splits it up into 3 different faces, 3 different tris. I'll just take my word for it. Why is there a problem with deformation? Why is there a problem with animation? Why do we not want these things? It's something like this. I drop this down. If I drop this shape, this vertex here, down, say on the y-axis, you'll notice it creates this strange looking thing. If I do the same on a normal plane made out of quads, grab this and move it along, you can see the major difference. That would do like 64 or something. I'll do. The other important thing about the shape is this. You cannot create edge loops on this. So imagine I'm going to bring out my pen here, my pencil rather. Oops. So imagine a line drawn down here. I can't draw that. Oopsie. You go over there. Imagine a line drawn down here. I'm useless at this. And you're trying to deform this shape down there. Well, you've got one vertex here. This is all good. But there ain't a vertex there. Okay, a little bit of a problem. So these vertices will deform without problem. But these two, well, they're going to create a bit of a mess, really, because it's not physically possible. So instead, if we go back to our quad, if we go back to our quad and try and do the same thing, you can already tell, no problems whatsoever. It gives us this sort of triangular thing, but again, with deformation, that's not an issue. This, on the other hand, gives us a very, very strange shape. Take it from me, most of the time, you don't want this. And if we try and subsurf this shape, You'll notice this gives us a nice curved effect. This doesn't. This gives us a very strange sort of pattern which you can see being reflected there. Now the next thing, we turn that off, is what about doing it the other way? Well, we've only got like we only have 2 vertices here, so it's not physically possible to bend it around there. So what we're going to have to do instead, of course, is add an edge loop, right? Add a whole loop of edges, and an entire edge go cutting through the middle there, and what that's going to do is allow it to be deformed, right? Well, if I try and do that, Control R, there ain't anything appearing anywhere. Now we can see now if Blender is going to be very clever. One of the most useful tools within Blender is being the ability to convert these tris into quads. This is normally achieved through Alt-J, but it doesn't always work. So let's see if it's going to work this time. Aha, it has done. Hasn't done it perfectly, but it's tried to get there. And of course we can do a bit of manual editing ourselves. You can probably tell here that the easiest thing to do is actually remove these triangles. But before I go ahead and do that, I'm going to get rid of that one. So what I'm going to do is merge these two. That's the wrong one. At last. There. So that's gotten rid of one of them. That's no problem. But this, on the other hand, this one is a very good example of something which I wanted to show you, which is the creation of an edge flow. Let's just grab this out. Yeah. Like that. Now this is very important, because what we have here, I didn't put these out properly, I was being lazy. What we have here is, if we go into face select mode, what we actually have here are 3 separate face loops. So it's 3 separate vertical loops of faces, which are being merged into 2 here at the bottom. If I were to take these edges out, you can probably see these have now been merged into 2. These 2. So this middle one has disappeared. And how has this happened? Because we've got a tri right in the middle of it. This is why tris are actually useful, because of their ability to turn these single loop, these 3 or even more. I could actually have 4 in here. I could have another tri here. And I'll just get rid of that vertex at the bottom there as well. And there's our faces. So now I've actually got 4 face loops coming in here. 1, 2, 3, and 4. 4 face loops. And these have been diverted very cleanly, very nicely into 2 of them. You cannot do this easily with quads. If you try and do it, it'll look horrible. So creating this sort of join is done using these tris. Right, well, I have decided to not show you one of my models, because I don't actually have any on this machine, but instead to show you this, which you should recognize as from Sintel, Blender's most recent open movie. And this is the stage 2 model, which was available on the Sintel blog. I thought it's probably best to show you an example from the professionals. Now you will be able to see that vast majority of this, and pretty much the entire model, has been made out of quads. Very nice, very normal sized quads like this. You can see that all of these, these shapes can be made successfully just out of quads. In fact, I just want to see this mesh. A lot of modelers like them in the ears. Nope. Wow.